Okay, so I have a special episode for you today. This whole episode is going to be devoted to just one story, which I covered in a previous episode. But since I covered that story, there's been multiple updates, and it's become this huge, complicated story. So it deserves its own video. So to briefly sum up the story so far, OP is a single man in his early 30s. OP has a brother who's 29, and his brother has 4 kids with his sister-in-law. The whole family is super biased towards the brother, the sister-in-law, and their 4 kids, and they basically just ignore OP. The parents basically just kicked OP out of the house when he turned 18, so OP had to just sort of scrap and save on his own, and eventually saved up to buy a house. Then, out of nowhere, his entire family shows up and expects OP to just give him his house because, well, they have 4 kids and they need it. The whole family was saying, "Do it for Dan, do it for Dan." OP refused, of course, and the sister-in-law got so upset that she physically attacked OP for not just handing over his house. I'll put a link in the description that goes back to the original video if you guys want to watch part 1, because this video is going to have parts 2, 3, and 4. Alright, part 2. After I kicked out my parents, brother, and sister-in-law for trying to force me to hand over my new house to my brother, I immediately went to my social media and told the story to the whole family. It spread pretty fast. I posted about it because I knew that the first thing my family would do when they got home was try to twist the event to make me the villain. And I was exactly right. But I had an hour to get started before them. Also, I had video evidence to back up my story about what they'd done. Being preemptive worked because I got a fair number of family members on my side right away. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law must have been all set to write their own post, but it was too late. So they didn't even bother trying to lie much. My parents, Dan, and sister-in-law had a few flying monkeys supporting them, but not much else. Plenty of others knew how entitled they already were. There was this one person in particular who called me. I don't know who they were, but they ranted at me that I was a horrible brother and I needed to make way for a real family man. I just ended the call and blocked the number. This did not happen again. The week went by, and my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch, just like they said they would in their prior ultimatum. They rang my doorbell like crazy, and also pounded on the door until I finally answered. I opened it just a crack, and they tried to shove their way in again, but I'd installed a couple of latch chains that prevented that, and I even braced my body against the door for good measure. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said that I was recording everything on camera and I would call the cops if they tried to force their way in again. My mother calmed them down, and then, in her most sickly sweet tone, asked me, "Are you ready to let your brother move in?" I told her and the rest of them to F off and never come back. My mother put on the crocodile tears and asked me, "Why can't you just do this for Dan? Because he's your beloved brother." I laughed and then bluntly said that I do not love him as a brother because he treated me like garbage for years, and they only encouraged him to do so. They're terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother. Then I told them to leave or I'd be calling the cops. They all left surprisingly easily, apart from my mother loudly crying and the others giving me dirty looks. You could say that making them leave was suspiciously easy. I thought this whole mess was over, but I guess I should have taken them more seriously because they had other stupid plans. I came home later that week on Friday evening to find a moving truck and my brother's minivan parked in the driveway. It was Dan, and my family was there moving stuff into my house. He just waved at me with a shit-eating grin when I saw him. I was furious and told him and the rest of his family to stop. But my sister-in-law smugly said, "Like it or not, we're moving in." Then, in the most fake way, she tilted her head and puckered her lips and said, "It's okay because your mommy allowed it. And you should always listen to what your mommy tells you." I seethed with rage hearing those words and looking at her smug, B-wordy face. So I locked myself in my truck to call the cops right away. When they realized what I was doing, my sister-in-law started pounding on my window and yelling at me to stop. "And you can't do that to us because me and Dan need this house," she cried. "Why can't you just do this for Dan?" I responded, "F Dan, it's my house, not his." Then she threatened to key the side of my truck unless I stopped calling the cops, all of which the 911 operator heard thanks to the window being slightly open. I told my sister-in-law that if she damaged my truck, I would sue her, and she was smart enough to retreat. When the cops arrived, Dan and my sister-in-law, along with their kids, had locked themselves in my house. I told the cops what had happened, as well as showing them my new driver's license that had my current address on it. Then, when we went to my front door, I found out they had changed my lock. The old lock was laying on the porch with the center of it drilled out, and the drill they had used was laying right next to it with a complete Harbor Freight drill bit set. Could they have been any more stupid leaving evidence out like that? I pointed out the broken lock and drill, then gave the cops a rundown on all the events that happened prior. Well, I guess Dan had called over our parents too because they showed up while I was talking to the cops. My parents immediately lied and started saying that I had agreed to rent my house to my brother and his family. I said that I could easily prove that to be a lie. So Dan and my sister-in-law finally came out of my house with some papers in hand. They both looked super smug, like they'd somehow outsmarted me. They had actually drawn up and printed out a fake rental agreement, but my signature wasn't on it. There was a signature, but it looked nothing like my handwriting. I don't think any of them have ever actually seen my signature, so that was incredibly stupid on their part. I told my parents and Dan that that was stupidly blatant fraud, and if the cops investigated, they'd easily figure that out. I said I don't think going to court and jail would do them any good. It could even make Dan lose his job, which is his only means of providing for his family. I also said that I would get a lawyer and sue for damages if anything of mine was lost, stolen, or broken. And I'd call Child Protective Services for good measure. Dan went white and looked really scared when I said all that, but my mother got between us and doubled down about how I should just do this for Dan and live in that camper so they can finally have a family home to themselves. I yelled at her that if she thought this was such a good idea, then she could do it for Dan herself and let Dan have her house. The cops separated my mother from me, and I said that I wanted them all out right now, or I would press charges. I told the cops they drilled out my front door, these lease papers were obviously fake, they badly forged my signature, and I have video evidence of my sister-in-law attacking me. I told them that these are felonies, and I could ruin their lives if I wanted. I said if they didn't leave, that's exactly what I would do. The only reason I hadn't done all this already was for the sake of Dan's kids. So they had this one last chance to get the F out of my house. The moment my parents heard that, I think it finally clicked that they couldn't force me to do it for Dan. My mother surrendered and said that she would put an end to this. Then she went over to my sister-in-law and spoke with her quietly for a minute while my father spoke to Dan. My sister-in-law instantly started loudly crying and ripping up the fake rental papers into tiny bits and tossing them like confetti, only to have an officer tell them to pick up the bits of paper or he would cite them for littering. At this point, both of the cops had this "I do not get paid enough for this" look on their faces. Dan had to start telling his kids to load their stuff back into the moving truck. The kids were all crying, and the oldest was sobbing that he wouldn't get his own room now. My sister-in-law and Dan gathered their kids up and tried to make one last pathetic attempt to guilt me with this sad family routine. You know, where they're all gathered together in a sort of group hug, but all facing me. I swear, I think they'd practiced it beforehand. Oh, all the kids had the same pleading look with quivering mouths. My sister-in-law kept rubbing her pregnant belly and tilting her head to look like a sad puppy. And my brother just made the saddest face he possibly could and said, "Please don't do this. We need to be able to live here." But I didn't falter, and I told them to keep packing. All the kids and the sister-in-law turned the crying up to 11, and Dan yelled at me, "Are you satisfied with yourself? You've denied us a home because you're too selfish to share and help out family." I was laughing like a maniac and said that what he was trying to do was taking, not sharing. No amount of crying would make me let his family move in because he is no brother of mine anymore. He's just an entitled prick who thinks that he can take whatever he wants from me like when we were kids. Dan started F-bombing me until the cops told him to cool off or he would be in cuffs regardless if I wanted to press charges or not. He sucked in his lips, and he looked like a mixture of being afraid and supremely pissed off. I asked the cops if they could stick around until my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all left. They said they had no intention of going anywhere until this had been resolved. In fact, in the next few minutes, 2 more cops showed up for whatever reason. That gave my parents some extra incentive to get moving. I made Dan give me the keys to the new lock that he had installed in my front door. But still, I got another lock installed the next day anyway because I didn't know if he had any copies of the keys or not. He was really reluctant to hand them over. Then, instead of handing them to me, he actually threw them down the street and into a storm drain while saying to go get them myself. But one of the cops scolded him for that and made him go get them. He had to pull the grate off just to go get them and got pretty dirty in the process. When he got the keys back, he just grumbled, then slammed them down into my hand. I then told them all to leave and never come back. My mother said I'd be disowned for this, as if that was some kind of threat to me. Then I said, "Oh no, that means I won't get to come to any holidays with you guys where I always get treated like garbage by you all anyways. Because Dan has always obviously been your favorite. You all treated me so badly when I was growing up that if Dan ever needs an organ donor, I wouldn't give him anything. So why don't you do like you always told me to do when I was mistreated by all of you and suck it up?" My parents were floored after I said all that, and the quartet of cops were looking pretty judgmental at them as well. My mother just started crying and walking away. My father just stood there looking like he wanted to hit me, and Dan just held his kids in defeat. Oh, and my sister-in-law was off having a tantrum in my front lawn. Soon enough, they all started carrying boxes of my brother's stuff out of my house. Nothing had been unpacked yet, so it was all taken out pretty quickly. But while doing all this, my mother kept saying, "It's not too late. You could still do this for Dan." She said that Dan could pay me rent if I let him stay. And when that didn't work, she said that I could move back in with them to let Dan rent my house so I wouldn't have to share the building. I told her to shut up and keep packing boxes. My sister-in-law ended up having another tantrum after hearing that and threw a box down. Then she sat on the ground having a pity party because she didn't want to have to go back to sharing a house with my parents. She just sat on the ground looking angry and sad until everyone else was finished. She didn't even want to get up when it was time to leave. Then, to summarize a couple of paragraphs, because OP is pretty wordy, they packed up in their vehicles. My sister-in-law just stood staring at me with malice until my brother finally got her to go into her minivan and drive home. As soon as they were all gone, I got back online and spilled the beans about what happened. My parents were too embarrassed to even try to defend their actions this time. And while the family was somewhat split before this incident, it was now a landslide in my favor. Many people in the family who I didn't expect to side with me did. That includes the former flying monkeys, so I guess they'd finally had enough. Around that time, I offered to host half the family at the next Christmas Eve in my new house, but my parents were not invited. My brother and my sister-in-law surprisingly didn't block me on Facebook. I saw that my sister-in-law had her 4th baby in early November. They're still living with my parents. I'm pretty sure they knew that I was reading their posts because my sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts every couple of weeks or so about not having enough space while living with my parents, probably to see if she can still guilt-trip me. And I'm sure that it's driving my mother and father up the wall because they aren't getting any peace and quiet in their old age with 3 rowdy, obnoxious kids, a mentally unstable sister-in-law, my golden child brother, and a newborn baby in the house all at once. Perhaps they could move into a camper in their own backyard and let Dan take over their house completely. They might get some peace then. Yeah, they could do that for Dan. Man, so the funny thing about this post is they're like, well, why don't you just let him move in and then he can pay you rent? That's like a good compromise, right? Well, lady, if he can pay rent, why doesn't he just get an apartment? Because we both know the answer. Because as soon as he moves in, he will immediately stop paying rent. Then OP posted another update. OP hosted the Christmas Eve party at his place, and then 2 hours into the party, you know who showed up. My parents, brother, and sister-in-law popped into my home looking all smiles. They didn't even knock, just walked right in my front door like they were meant to be there. I shut off the music and told them to leave immediately. They begged to stay and said they brought gifts. One of my uncles stood up and yelled at them before I got another chance to speak. He said they don't deserve to be in my home or my life after the stunt they tried to pull months earlier. Several other of my relatives backed me up. Mind you, this guy is my mother's brother. He used to love her to pieces until he found out about the stuff that went on between me and my parents. My mother's parents, as old as they are, hurriedly got in between us and said to my parents that if they want to make amends with me, it's far too soon. They said they'd never been more disappointed in them than they were this past year. They'd hidden their favoritism for my brother from prying eyes for a long time, but no one was fooled anymore. They said they needed to make a serious effort to try to actually treat me like a son if they ever wanted to be in my life again. My sister-in-law went back to her old standard of crying and had a pity party about how she should be the one living here, not me. She plopped down in a chair to have a tantrum and say that it wasn't fair that I got this house to myself when I don't have a family of my own. And she has 4 kids, so she needs more space. She just wanted a better place to live in and feel like a real mom. This was petty of me, but I loudly pointed out that she sucks as a mother because she lets my mother do most of the parenting while she sits on her butt all day drinking, playing on her phone, and going out and spending all of Dan's money. And she has the nerve to complain about it. I even joke that I'm surprised her baby doesn't get drunk from her breast milk because she drinks so much booze. My sister-in-law demanded to know, "Are you calling me a bad mom?" I said the evidence speaks for itself. And if she wanted to be able to afford to move out of her parents' house someday, then she needs to put her college degree to some use, get a job, and learn to save money. My mother already does most of the childcare for my brother's kids anyways, so she'd have plenty of time after her baby gets a little older. My brother's oldest kid, who's 7, ran up to me, kicking and screaming at me for yelling at his mom. He kept yelling at me about how his mom said that I was a bad guy who made her cry and didn't let them live here. That's when my brother grabbed his son to pull him away. At this point, all of my other relatives jumped back in, and it sort of turned into a family intervention against my sister-in-law and brother. My sister-in-law and all of her kids were crying. Hell, even Dan was nearly in tears from the verbal lashing that he was being assaulted with. He ended up just sitting on a chair, looking like a complete wreck. He couldn't even say 2 words to me. Soon after, my parents, brother, and sister-in-law all left in defeat. The party resumed, and we all avoided speaking of what just happened for the rest of the evening. After Christmas, my sister-in-law did finally stop making posts that were obvious digs at me, and deleted all of the old posts as well. But shortly after the new year, she more recently made a post complaining about how she tried to convince my parents to get a camper like I did. That way, it could be set up in the backyard so Dan and his family could use the whole house as their family home. Well, a taste of one's own medicine is never fun, because my parents turned that idea down vehemently, I hear. No one's gonna let someone else push them out of their own house, let alone their master bedroom. The post was only up for a couple of days before my sister-in-law removed it. She's hardly posted anything since then. She loves to complain. But if a tree falls and no one's around to hear it, can it still complain? And then amazingly, there's another update. I think this might honestly be the single longest story I've ever covered on my entire YouTube channel. Okay, the saga continues in part 4. A few weeks after the last update, OP posts another update. My parents recently got in touch with me through social media, asking for a meeting in a public place of my choosing. This just screamed, "Warning! Trap!" But I wasn't afraid. In fact, I was amused. They know that they can't screw me over anymore. I picked a local restaurant and we met up there. Dan was with them, but he kept his mouth shut most of the time. We had awkward greetings, ordered some drinks, and then cut to the chase. My parents begged me to help Dan get his own apartment so that he could finally move out. Apparently, Dan's credit isn't so great. Gee, I wonder why. Could it be that his wife regularly spins him into a hole? Well, they asked that I help, either by supplying some money or by co-signing for the apartment and helping to pay for the rent. I simply said no to both. That's when Dan spoke up in anger and yelled at me that I have so much, and I don't have a family to support like he does. He needed my help, and I should be sparing the money for his family since I don't have one myself. I laughed and asked where they were when I needed their help. Oh, that's right. They were pointing and laughing at me for being homeless. My father and Dan both just looked away and said nothing. Pretty sure they wanted to say something like they used to at me, but they held their tongues. Then OP goes into this long explanation of his finances and tells his family that he's not as rich as they seem to think he is. Dan just got up, said this was all just a waste of their time and that he was leaving. Then, just to kill them with kindness, I offered to buy them a round of unlimited soup and salad while we were all there. I guess they couldn't turn down free food, so they stayed. I went out of my way to talk about anything other than money. Dan remained quiet and was either eating his food or looking at his phone. My parents just awkwardly talked with me. When the meal was finished, Dan left a $10 bill on the table for the tip and walked off without saying another word to me or anyone. My mother just excused his behavior and we all parted ways. That was about it. As for my sister-in-law, well, she's been regularly complaining online about my parents. She really doesn't seem to like the fact that she's not the queen bee of their house. And I think her toxicity is finally getting to them. Why else would they be so desperate to come crawling back to me? Man, OP, that is a wild ride. And while it does seem like things have settled down, I'd be surprised if this is the last bit of drama in your life. That was rSlash Entitled People, and if you like this content, check out my podcast where I publish the exact same episodes. Also, hit that subscribe button because I put out new Reddit videos every single day.